The Arizona Territory, 1887. Dust settled on the crude wooden sign marking the edge of Copper Springs, a town where whispers carried like tumbleweeds. They called him Shadow Wolf, the feared Apache warrior who walked between two worlds but belonged to neither. They called her Widow Gardner, gray-haired, discarded, a woman whose best years were behind her. When the matchmaker paired them in what everyone deemed a cruel joke, laughter echoed through the saloons. Shadow Wolf accepted with stoic silence, Mrs. Gardner with quiet dignity. What could possibly bind these two outcasts together? Would this unlikely union crumble beneath the town's mockery, or would it reveal something extraordinary that no one saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the Arizona Territory, painting the desert in hues of amber and gold. Shadow Wolf stood at the edge of his small cabin, watching as the first light touched the distant mountains. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising into the crisp morning air. The cabin sat half a mile from Copper Springs, close enough for necessity, far enough for peace. A single room with a bed table and stove, everything in its place, orderly and spare. The only decoration, a painted buffalo hide hanging on the eastern wall, a remnant of his mother's people. He removed his cavalry scout badge from the wooden peg by the door. The silver caught the sunlight, a symbol of his uneasy alliance with the white man's army. 3 years of tracking for them, showing paths through mountains, reading signs invisible to their eyes, guiding them through territory that had once belonged solely to his ancestors. Scout, they called him. Never his name. Shadow Wolf tucked the badge into his pocket and saddled his paint horse. The animal nickered softly, the only creature that didn't judge the blood that ran through his veins. "Easy, brother," he murmured in Apache. His mother's tongue felt sacred in the morning quiet. He mounted and rode toward Fort Buchanan, where Captain Miller waited. Another day of tracking, another day of standing between worlds, belonging to neither. The fort's wooden gates loomed ahead. Soldiers stiffened at his approach, hands drifting to rifle stocks. 3 years, and still they watched him like a snake ready to strike. "Wolf's here," one called, deliberately dropping the shadow from his name. Captain Miller emerged from his office, map in hand. A decent man by most measures, though his eyes never quite met Shadow Wolf's directly. "Got reports of Cochise's band 15 miles south," Miller said, unfolding the map across a rough wooden table. "Need you to confirm before we send troops." Shadow Wolf nodded once. 3 days. "I'll bring signs." 2 days, Miller countered. Always pushing, these men who didn't understand the desert's pace. Shadow Wolf didn't argue. Arguments with white men led nowhere good. As he turned to leave, a soldier spat in the dust near his horse. "Don't get confused about which side you're on, Injun." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Shadow Wolf felt the eyes of the garrison upon him, waiting for the savage reaction they expected. He kept his face still as stone, though beneath his ribcage an old fire burned. He remembered his father's words, "Show them nothing. The Apache warrior holds his power inside." Shadow Wolf rode through town on his return. A necessary risk. He needed supplies. Children stopped their play to stare. Women gathered their skirts as if his shadow might stain them. Men watched with hands near belt knives. At Hadley's general store, he dismounted and tied his horse. The girl who'd been sweeping the porch scurried inside at his approach. Through the window, he saw her urgent whispers to the shopkeeper. The store fell silent as he entered. 3 women gathered by the fabric bolts froze mid-conversation. A man selecting tobacco stepped back to watch him. Shadow Wolf placed a small pouch of coins on the counter. "Coffee, salt, cornmeal," words measured, voice low. Hadley nodded, kept his distance as he gathered the items. "Overcharged him, as always." Shadow Wolf paid without comment. As he loaded his supplies, he felt her eyes before he saw her. The widow woman, Gardner, watching from the milliner's doorway across the street. Unlike the others, her gaze held no fear, only a quiet curiosity. She nodded slightly, a gesture so small he nearly missed it. He returned the nod before mounting his horse. An acknowledgement between outsiders. Nothing more. That night in his cabin, Shadow Wolf sat by the fire carving a piece of cedar wood. The small clay bowl beside him held dried sage and sweetgrass. His mother's people believed purification came through smoke and prayer. His father's people taught that strength came from silence and solitude. He held both truths in his hands as he worked the wood into the shape of a wolf. Outside, coyotes called to the rising moon, their voices wild and free. Shadow Wolf closed his eyes and remembered a time when he too had belonged to a pack. The matchmaker's arrangement lay heavy on his mind. Not because he feared the town's mockery, their opinions meant nothing to him, but because of the widow woman's eyes. Eyes that had seen sorrow, yet remained unclouded by hatred. Perhaps, he thought, watching the fire's dying embers, that was a kind of strength worth knowing. Elizabeth Gardner awakened to the familiar sound of commerce below her rented room. The general store opened early, and Mr. Hadley's voice carried through the thin floorboards as he directed his son on stocking shelves. 5 years in this room, and still the morning bustle startled her from dreams of Vermont. She rose and moved to the small wash basin by the window. Grey light filtered through the faded curtains. She'd sown her first month in Copper Springs, back when hope still colored her vision of Western life. The mirror above revealed what time had written, silver threading through once auburn hair, lines etching themselves around eyes that had cried a lifetime's worth of tears. Elizabeth opened the small porcelain box on her dresser, removing the tortoise-shell comb Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. "Something beautiful for my beautiful bride," he'd said. The comb's teeth were worn now, like her, but still serviceable. She ran it through her hair, counting strokes as her mother had taught her. Order and routine, the backbone of dignity. Dressed in her second-best day dress, navy cotton with only one mended tear at the cuff, Elizabeth organized her small living space. The single room served as bedroom, sitting room and kitchen, though kitchen generously described the corner with its hot plate and single shelf of provisions. Books lined the wall opposite her bed. Shakespeare, Emerson, botanical references, and pedagogical texts from her teaching days. Knowledge, at least, required little space to store. At precisely 8 o'clock, she descended the narrow stairs to the store below. Mrs. Hadley nodded curtly from behind the counter. The same greeting exchanged for 5 years. Not unkind, merely efficient. "Good morning, Mrs. Hadley. Beautiful day coming, I think." Indeed, Mrs. Gardner, always formal, these exchanges. Never Elizabeth, never Martha. As if using Christian names might blur the lines between landlord and tenant. Outside, Copper Springs awakened fully. Elizabeth navigated the boardwalk with practiced precision, nodding to those who acknowledged her, pretending not to notice those who didn't. The Patterson girls giggled behind their hands as she passed. At 16, they found an aging widow woman inherently amusing, particularly one forced to work for her bread. The schoolhouse appeared ahead, a modest building where she'd once taught. Now Miss Abernathy held that position, younger, unmarried, with a father on the town council. Elizabeth continued past to Mrs. Whitaker's dress shop, where 3 days a week she mended fine garments with stitches so tiny they nearly disappeared into the fabric. "Elizabeth, you're early." Harriet Whitaker's voice was the day's first kindness. In a town full of formality, Harriet used her Christian name, perhaps because, at 62, she stood even further beyond marriageable age than Elizabeth's 46 years. "Thought I'd finish the Larson girls' communion dress." "The ceremony's Sunday." Harriet nodded, setting a cup of tea beside Elizabeth's workstation. "Did you hear about the Thornton baby? Born at dawn. Their 4th boy." Elizabeth's fingers stilled momentarily on white cotton. "Another boy. How fortunate they are." The shadow that passed across her face didn't escape Harriet's notice. The older woman squeezed her shoulder gently before continuing to the front of the shop, where customers would soon arrive. Elizabeth bent over her needlework, each stitch a meditation. She'd come west with Thomas full of dreams, adventure, prosperity, children. Teaching positions had been plentiful for educated women in growing territories. They'd planned to save for 2 years, then build a home, then start their family. Typhoid took Thomas before they'd saved enough for land. Took their future children too, though they'd never drawn breath. At noon, Elizabeth ate her simple lunch, bread, cheese, and an apple in the small garden behind the shop. The town's newly appointed matchmaker, Cordelia Simmons, found her there. Elizabeth Gardner. "I've been looking all over for you." Cordelia settled her substantial frame on the bench, eyes bright with purpose. Elizabeth suppressed a sigh. "Cordelia, what brings you here?" "I've had the most interesting conversation with the mayor." Cordelia leaned closer, voice dropping. "About your situation." "My situation requires no discussion, thank you." "Nonsense. A woman needs security. And the town has concerns." Elizabeth's spine straightened. "Concerns?" "About your rent. The arrangement with the Hadleys can't continue indefinitely." Cordelia patted Elizabeth's hand. "But I have a solution. A match at my age?" "Don't be absurd." Cordelia's smile tightened. "Not absurd at all. There's a man who needs domestication. The arrangement would benefit you both." Something in Cordelia's tone raised Elizabeth's suspicions. "Which man?" "The Indian scout. Shadow Wolf." Elizabeth nearly dropped her teacup. "The Apache." "Surely you jest." "I never jest about matchmaking." Cordelia rose, brushing imaginary dust from her skirts. "The papers are drawn. The mayor himself has approved. Tomorrow at noon, Town Hall." She departed with the confidence of someone who'd never known true hunger or desperation. Elizabeth sat motionless, the tortoiseshell comb suddenly heavy in her pocket. Security, yes, but at what cost to her pride? Pride, she reminded herself bitterly, fed no one and paid no rent. Noon sun beat down on Copper Springs Town Hall, a building more pretentious than its dusty surroundings warranted. Mayor Frederick Holloway adjusted his silk waistcoat, watching through the window as townsfolk gathered for the spectacle. His polished walking stick, a gift from the governor himself, leaned against his mahogany desk. "Quite a turnout," said Marshall Davis, the town banker, rubbing his hands together. "Haven't seen excitement like this since we hanged that cattle rustler." The mayor smiled thinly. "People enjoy novelty. And what could be more novel than wedding a savage to an aging widow?" Davis chuckled. "That bet was inspired, Frederick. $20 says she runs crying before the month's out. 30 says he scalps her first." Sheriff Porter joined their laughter from his position by the door, his brass deputy badge catching the sunlight as he crossed his arms. Mayor Holloway silenced them with a gesture as Cordelia Simmons entered. The town's matchmaker clutched her leather-bound register to her ample bosom, face flushed from the heat, or perhaps nerves. "Gentlemen," she nodded curtly, less comfortable with the arrangement than they. "They've both arrived. Excellent. Show in our happy couple." The mayor's voice dripped with mockery. Elizabeth Gardner entered first, spine straight as a cavalry officer's. Her best dress, faded blue calico with lace collar, had seen better days, but was pressed to perfection. Her eyes met the mayor's briefly, revealing neither submission nor fear, only a weary determination that momentarily checked his amusement. Shadow Wolf followed, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, though it wasn't necessary. The Apache's presence immediately altered the room's atmosphere. Where Elizabeth brought dignity, he brought danger, controlled and contained, but unmistakable. He wore the white man's clothes, dark trousers and a simple cotton shirt, but they couldn't disguise the warrior's grace in his movements. "Well," Mayor Holloway clapped his hands together. "What a delightful occasion. Please stand before the desk." They moved forward, keeping careful distance between them. Shadow Wolf's face revealed nothing. Elizabeth's cheeks burned with what might have been shame or anger. "Mrs. Gardner, Mr. Wolf?" The mayor cleared his throat. "Or do you prefer Shadow?" "I'm never certain with your kind." The Apache said nothing. His silence stretched uncomfortably until the mayor continued with forced joviality. "You both understand the arrangement. By town ordinance, widows without means of support become wards of the town after 5 years. Rather than burden our public funds, we've established a matchmaking program. He gestured to Cordelia, who opened her register with reluctance. Mrs. Gardner's late husband left considerable debts. The general store has generously extended credit these many years, but accounts must eventually balance. The mayor's tone suggested this generosity had been his doing rather than the Hadleys. As for you, Mr. Wolf, the army has requested that scouts demonstrate civilization. To continue employment, a household qualifies. Outside, voices grew louder as more townspeople arrived. Several pressed faces against the window glass. Shall we proceed? The mayor gestured to Cordelia. The matchmaker stepped forward. According to Town Charter, Section 12, Paragraph 3, I hereby record the household arrangement between Mrs. Elizabeth Gardner, widow, and Mr. Shadow Wolf, scout. Her voice trembled slightly. The arrangement provides that Mrs. Gardner will maintain a proper household, and Mr. Wolf will provide financial support and protection. The term is renewable annually by mutual consent, or may be dissolved by town council for cause. Cordelia opened a small inkwell and offered a pen. Please sign the register. Elizabeth took the pen, her hand steady as she signed her name in elegant script. Shadow Wolf accepted it next, surprising them with equally refined penmanship. The Apache had been mission-educated, Elizabeth recalled. Another detail the town conveniently overlooked. The mayor stamped the page with official-looking flourish. Congratulations. Copper Springs' most unique household is established. He turned to the window and gestured, prompting cheers and catcalls from outside. Several men held money, already collecting or paying on wages. Elizabeth's cheeks flamed deeper, but her voice remained controlled. Is there anything else required, Mayor Holloway? Just one formality. He retrieved a small brass key from his desk drawer. The property at the north edge of town. Abandoned years ago, but the roof doesn't leak. Consider it the town's wedding gift. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Unless you prefer to live in a wickiup like your new protector's people. Shadow Wolf remained impassive, but Elizabeth took the key with a cold nod. Your generosity overwhelms, Mayor. Good day. She turned, head high, and walked toward the door. Shadow Wolf followed at a respectful distance, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. As they emerged onto the town hall steps, the gathered crowd fell momentarily silent before erupting into laughter and jeers. Elizabeth's steps faltered almost imperceptibly before resuming their determined pace. Shadow Wolf maintained his position behind her right shoulder, his presence somehow protective without touching or acknowledging her. They parted at the bottom of the steps without a word. She toward the general store, he toward the livery stable. United on paper, separated by worlds. Behind them the betting continued. 3 days passed before Elizabeth ventured to the north edge of town. The small house stood alone against the landscape, weathered boards silvered by sun and time. Not condemned, as the mayor had implied, but abandoned to the elements like herself. She inserted the brass key into the rusted lock. It turned with reluctant protest. The door swung inward, revealing a single room thick with dust and memories of previous occupants. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow bed frame were the only furnishings. Elizabeth stepped inside, her practical assessment overriding disappointment. The roof was indeed intact. The stone chimney appeared sound. Windows, though grimy, remained unbroken. She could make this habitable, given time and materials she didn't possess. A sound from behind startled her. Shadow Wolf stood in the doorway, silhouetted by afternoon light. In his hands, a burlap sack and what appeared to be tools. Mrs. Gardner. His deep voice carried no inflection. Mr. Wolf. She straightened, suddenly conscious of her dusty hands and hair. I was just inspecting. He nodded once, then gestured to the items he carried. Brought supplies. Elizabeth watched as he set them on the table. Hammer, nails, a small tin of tallow, rope, and a folded bundle of cloth. Practical items for repair and cleaning. Had he anticipated the house's condition? Thank you. That's most considerate. Formality felt safer than genuine gratitude. Shadow Wolf glanced around the room, his dark eyes assessing. Need more wood for repairs? We'll bring tomorrow. There's no need, Elizabeth began, then stopped herself. Pride wouldn't fix broken floorboards. That would be helpful. Thank you. An awkward silence stretched between them. What did one say to a man who was her husband on paper, but a stranger in reality? A man the town had paired her with as a cruel joke. She reached into her basket and withdrew a small stone crock wrapped in cloth. I've brought stew. Not much, but would you care to share it? Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps. He nodded once. Elizabeth unwrapped the small cast-iron pot she carried beneath her stew. It had been Thomas's, used on his prospecting trips. She arranged kindling in the fireplace, aware of Shadow Wolf's silent observation. "Do you have matches?" she asked, realizing she'd forgotten to bring any. Without a word, he knelt beside her, produced a flint from his pocket, and with expert movements coaxed a spark into the dry kindling. The fire caught quickly, as if eager to please its master. They ate in silence, sharing the single spoon she'd brought, taking turns with formal precision. The stew was simple: rabbit, carrots, potatoes, and herbs she'd gathered from behind Mrs. Whitaker's shop. Shadow Wolf ate with neat efficiency, revealing neither pleasure nor displeasure at the taste. "Tomorrow," he said finally, setting down the empty crock, "I'll fix the door." "Things wrong," Elizabeth nodded. "I noticed. And the back window is stuck." "Yes, frame warped." He rose, gathering his hat. "You're not staying here tonight?" "No, not yet. It needs cleaning first." He seemed to consider this. Sensible. As he moved toward the door, Elizabeth noticed a small object that had fallen from his pocket. A wooden whistle, simply carved but beautiful in its functionality. She retrieved it, holding it out. "You dropped this." Shadow Wolf looked at the whistle in her palm, then at her face. "Keep it by your bed. I don't understand. If there's trouble, blow 3 times. I'll hear." The implication that he would come if she needed help hung between them, neither acknowledged nor rejected. Elizabeth closed her fingers around the whistle, unexpectedly moved by this practical concern for her safety. "Where will you be?" "My cabin, half-mile west." He pointed through the window toward a stand of cottonwoods, barely visible in the distance. "Can see this house from there." The knowledge that he would be watching, protecting her even from afar, should have felt intrusive. Instead, Elizabeth found it oddly comforting. "Thank you, Mr. Wolf." He paused at the doorway, framed again by sunlight. "Shadow, pardon, my name. Shadow Wolf, or just Shadow." A slight hesitation. "Not Mr. Wolf." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. The white man's formality sat awkwardly on him, as uncomfortable as the arrangement itself. "Shadow, then." She offered a small smile. "I'm Elizabeth." He nodded once, accepting this exchange of names as a small but significant treaty. Then he was gone, moving across the landscape with the silent grace that had earned him his name. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching until his figure disappeared among the cottonwoods. The wooden whistle felt warm in her hand, its smooth surface worn by use. A simple thing, practical, functional, unadorned. Like its maker, she slipped it into her pocket and turned back to the dusty room. Tomorrow would bring enough work to exhaust her body, if not her thoughts. The Copper Springs Chronicle rarely printed more than cattle prices and church announcements. But its latest edition featured a prominent headline: "Savage and Spinster, a Marriage of Misfortune." Editor Wilson had outdone himself, dedicating half the front page to what he termed the social experiment on the town's edge. "They say she's teaching him table manners," Agatha Porter told the circle of women gathered at the Mercantile. "Imagine that, trying to civilize a wild Apache with a fork." Laughter rippled through the group as Elizabeth entered, her shopping basket over her arm. The conversation halted abruptly, replaced by exaggerated interest in fabric bolts and button selections. Elizabeth kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the whispers that resumed as she approached the counter. Mr. Hadley's smile strained with discomfort as he filled her modest order. "Flour, salt, coffee? Hear you've been fixing up that old Mason place," he said, and clearly attempting normal conversation. "Yes, it's coming along." Elizabeth counted out her coins carefully. Hadley lowered his voice. "My wife wonders if you'd be more comfortable staying in your room above the store." No need to rush into cohabitation. The implication hung heavy. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. The arrangement provides for a household, Mr. Hadley. I intend to honor my commitments. Of course, but will that be all, sir? Her tone permitted no further discussion. As Elizabeth left the store, something struck her skirt. A small clod of dirt thrown by one of the porter boys hiding behind a water barrel. His friend's muffled laughter followed her down the boardwalk. Mrs. Wolfe, or do you prefer Squaw Gardner now? Called Jimmy Porter, emboldened by distance. Elizabeth continued walking, back straight, eyes forward. The parcel of supplies felt suddenly heavy in her arms. Across the street, outside the saloon, Shadow Wolf dismounted from his paint horse. He'd completed another scouting assignment for the cavalry and carried his payment, actual currency rather than the usual scrip given to Indians. The arrangement had unexpectedly improved his standing with the army, though not in the way the town council had intended. "Here comes the happy husband," drawled Frank Donovan from the saloon doorway. "Tell us, does she wear feathers to bed?" Several men chuckled, watching for the Apache's reaction. Shadow Wolf ignored them, securing his horse to the hitching post. "Hey, Injun, I'm talking to you." Donovan stepped onto the boardwalk, liquor emboldening him. "Town's got a pool going on. How long before you run back to your tribe?" "I got good money saying you won't last the month." Shadow Wolf continued checking his saddlebags, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Maybe she's wore you out already. Them dried-up old spinsters get mighty desperate." A tightening of Shadow Wolf's shoulders was the only indication he'd heard. He removed a small package wrapped in buckskin from his saddlebag, coffee beans he'd traded for with a Mexican freighter. Elizabeth had mentioned liking the smell. Donovan, irritated by the lack of response, moved closer. "Or maybe you're the one disappointing her. Do savages even know how to please a white woman?" Shadow Wolf turned then, his dark eyes meeting Donovan's. He said nothing, but something in his gaze made the drunk take an involuntary step backward. From across the street, Elizabeth witnessed the exchange. She saw Shadow Wolf notice her, saw the slight nod of acknowledgement he offered. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of their position as targets for the town's cruelty. Donovan, following Shadow Wolf's gaze, spotted Elizabeth. "Well, look there." Mrs. Wolfe herself, come to collect her pet Indian. Before Elizabeth could move away, Shadow Wolf crossed the street toward her. Not running, not rushing, his pace measured and dignified. He reached her side and relieved her of the heavy parcel without asking permission. "New roof boards arrived," he said, as if they were any ordinary couple discussing household matters. "Cabin's finished." Elizabeth understood his strategy immediately. Normalcy as defense. She nodded, adjusting her shawl. "Excellent. I've made curtains for the windows." Together, they walked toward the north edge of town, side by side but not touching. Behind them, Donovan's taunts faded into the afternoon heat. "They're betting on us," Elizabeth said quietly when they'd passed the last buildings. "Yes." Shadow Wolf shifted the parcels to his other arm. "Mayor put $20 on you leaving by first snow." Elizabeth's step faltered. "How do you know this?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "People talk freely around Indians. Think we don't understand. That's infuriating. Sometimes useful." He nodded toward the house visible in the distance. "Davis bet 50 against us lasting a year." Elizabeth considered this. "And if we did? Last a year?" Shadow Wolf looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new in her determined expression. "Would be interesting," he said finally. Elizabeth felt an unexpected smile forming. Yes, it would be interesting indeed. The small chalkboard from the schoolhouse, discarded for newer slate, hung forgotten on a nail in the mayor's office. On it, in his own hand, he'd written the names of those betting against the strange household at the edge of town. Not a single wager favored their success. Elizabeth knelt in the small patch of earth behind the house, turning soil with a borrowed garden trowel. A week of cleaning and repairs had transformed the abandoned dwelling into something approaching habitable. Shadow Wolf had replaced the roof boards, fixed the sagging porch, and rehung the crooked door. Elizabeth had scrubbed every surface, hung the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, and arranged her few possessions with care. Now, with the house taking shape, she turned her attention outward. A kitchen garden would provide both sustenance and purpose. Wrong time. She startled at Shadow Wolf's voice. Despite his size, he moved with unnerving silence. He stood at the edge of her freshly turned earth, a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. "For planting," he clarified. Too late in season. Elizabeth sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. "Perhaps, but I can prepare the soil for spring, and some hardy herbs might still take." He considered this, then nodded. Practical thinking earned his respect. He unslung the bag and knelt beside her, keeping a proper distance. "Brought something." From the bag he withdrew several small packets made of folded paper. "Seeds for medicine." Elizabeth accepted the packets, unfolding one carefully. Tiny dark seeds nestled in the crease. "What are they?" "Echinacea, for fever and infection." He pointed to each packet in turn. "Yarrow for wounds, mint for stomach pain, sage for cleansing." Elizabeth studied the seeds with new interest. "You know plants?" "My mother was a healer." Something in his voice softened when he spoke of her. "She taught me." From her apron pocket, Elizabeth withdrew a small, leather-bound journal, its pages worn with use. She opened it, revealing handwritten notes and careful sketches of plants. My grandmother was also a healer, in her way. She called it kitchen medicine. I've added to her knowledge over the years. She turned pages filled with neat script and detailed drawings. "This is feverfew, good for headaches. And here, comfrey for bruises." Shadow Wolf studied the journal with evident interest, his finger hovering above but not touching the detailed illustrations. "Good drawings, accurate. Thank you. I was fortunate. My father believed girls should be educated." She hesitated, then asked, "Can you read?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Yes, mission school until 12 years. Then father died. Mother took me back to the people." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to assume." He shrugged, unoffended. "Most don't expect it." They worked side by side, marking out areas for different plants. Shadow Wolf explained how certain herbs should be kept separate, how others grew better together. Elizabeth recorded his knowledge in her journal, adding it to her grandmother's wisdom. "This yarrow," she said, examining one of his seed packets. "I know it as soldier's woundwort. We used it during the war, when bandages ran short." "You were in the war?" He looked up, surprised. "I volunteered as a nurse. Before I met Thomas." She traced the drawing of yarrow in her journal. "So much suffering." Shadow Wolf nodded. "My father fought with Kit Carson. Against Navajo, not by choice, forced to fight his own kind. The injustice sounded all too familiar. Government said fight or lose everything." His hands continued working the soil, but his mind seemed elsewhere. He chose survival, as we all do in our way. Elizabeth watched a pair of quails skitter across the yard. "Is that why you scout for the army?" "Survival?" He considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Partly also to know their movements. Protect my mother's people when I can." His honesty surprised her. Such words could be considered treason if spoken to others. That he trusted her enough to share them felt significant. "Your knowledge of plants," he said, changing the subject. "Where did you learn drawing?" "My father taught mathematics and natural philosophy at a small college. He believed in observation and recording. Said a thing isn't truly seen until it's properly drawn." She smiled at the memory. "He thought I might become a scientific illustrator. Before I came west." "Why did you come?" The directness of Apache speech still startled her. No polite circling, no delicate avoidance of personal matters. Adventure, I suppose. And Thomas was very persuasive. She patted the soil around a small transplanted sage. Vermont seemed very small after the war. The territories promised space. Shadow Wolf nodded, understanding. "And you?" she asked. "Why stay here, where you're treated poorly?" He looked toward the distant mountains, gold in the late afternoon light. This was Apache land long before White Eyes came. "My mother is buried beneath those peaks." His expression remained neutral, but his voice carried conviction. "I won't be driven from her." They worked until sunset, the shared labor creating a comfortable silence between them. When Shadow Wolf finally rose to leave, Elizabeth offered him the journal. Would you like to borrow it? To see the other plants? He seemed genuinely surprised by the offer, but shook his head. Another time, perhaps. When my hands are cleaner. As he turned to go, Elizabeth called after him. Will you eat with me tomorrow? I've made stew with the rabbit you brought. Shadow Wolf paused, then nodded once. I'll bring bread. From the Mexican woman who sells by the creek. It wasn't friendship exactly, Elizabeth thought, as she watched him walk toward his cabin in the distance. But it was a beginning, this fragile recognition of common ground between them. The narrow path to Willow Creek wound through cottonwood trees and scrubby underbrush. Elizabeth carried a small woven basket, searching for the wild mint Shadow Wolf had mentioned grew along the water's edge. Her herb garden was taking shape, but wild harvested plants often held stronger medicine, according to both her grandmother and Shadow Wolf's mother. The similarity in their beliefs continued to surprise her. Two women from different worlds, reaching similar conclusions through careful observation. Perhaps people weren't so different at heart. The creek came into view, silver water catching morning light. Elizabeth knelt beside a patch of mint, inhaling its sharp, clean scent. Her fingers worked methodically, cutting stems with small shears rather than pulling roots, ensuring the plants would grow again. A leather canteen hung from her belt. Shadow Wolf's insistence. Desert takes water from you before you know thirst, he'd warned. Their conversations over the past weeks had shifted from polite formality to practical exchanges. He'd shown her which plants were safe, which berries to avoid. She taught him to read fever by touching the forehead rather than the wrist. Not friendship, precisely, but a growing mutual respect. Elizabeth moved downstream, basket half filled with mint. The creek widened here, forming a small pool before continuing its journey. Willows trailed delicate branches in the water. She stopped to sketch a cluster of unfamiliar purple flowers in the small notebook she now carried. Voices drifted from around the bend. Male voices, rough with liquor despite the early hour. Elizabeth stiffened, recognizing trouble before she could identify its source. She gathered her basket and turned to retreat up the path. Too late. 3 men on horseback rounded the bend. Elizabeth recognized Frank Donovan and the Miller brothers from town. Their red-rimmed eyes and unsteady postures confirmed her suspicions about their sobriety. Well, look here, Donovan called, his voice slurring. It's Mrs. Injun herself, gathering weeds. Elizabeth straightened her spine. Good morning, gentlemen. Excuse me? She attempted to pass, but Donovan maneuvered his horse to block the path. Not so fast. We've been wondering about you and that savage. He dismounted, swaying slightly. Town's got questions about what exactly goes on in that little house. Whatever goes on is no one's concern but our own. Elizabeth clutched her basket tighter. Now please move aside. The younger Miller brother laughed. Hear that, boys? The squaw's got spirit. I'm late for an appointment. Elizabeth tried again to pass, but Donovan stepped closer. We just want to know one thing. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey. Does he treat you like a white woman, or does he make you live like a squaw? Elizabeth refused to dignify the question with a response. She attempted to step around him, but Donovan grabbed her arm. Let go of me. Sir? Her voice remained steady, despite the fear building inside her. Answer the question first. His fingers dug painfully into her flesh. Remove your hand. Elizabeth met his gaze directly, channeling every ounce of schoolteacher authority she'd once possessed. Donovan's grip tightened. Or what? Your pet Injun ain't here to help you. I believe the lady asked you to remove your hand. All four turned toward the new voice. Shadow Wolf stood 20 feet away, so still he might have been part of the landscape. How long he'd been there, Elizabeth couldn't guess. Donovan released her arm but didn't step back. This ain't your business, Injun. Mrs. Gardner is my wife. Shadow Wolf's voice remained even, almost conversational. That makes it my business. The older Miller brother dismounted, hand drifting to the pistol on his hip. 3 against 1, Apache. Bad odds. Shadow Wolf's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted subtly. For you, yes. A moment of tense silence followed. Elizabeth saw Donovan's confidence waver as he truly looked at Shadow Wolf, saw not just the Indian he dismissed daily, but the warrior beneath the calm exterior. "We don't want trouble," Donovan said, taking a step back. "Just having some fun." "Your fun is finished." Shadow Wolf nodded toward their horses. "Go!" The younger miller, still mounted, spat in Shadow Wolf's direction. "Army's protection won't last forever, Injun. One day—" "Today is not that day," Shadow Wolf cut him off. "Choose if you want it to be." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, made even the drunken cowboys reassess their situation. Donovan mounted his horse with exaggerated dignity. "Come on, boys. Not worth our time." He glared at Elizabeth. "Town was right about you. You're native already." They rode off, shouting insults that faded with distance. Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her silver hair ornament, a small dragonfly pin that had belonged to her mother, had fallen to the ground during the confrontation. She bent to retrieve it, her hand trembling slightly. Shadow Wolf approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "Are you harmed?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Only my pride." She attempted to refasten the pin to her hair, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Shadow Wolf studied her face, then gestured to the pin. "May I?" The request surprised her. She nodded hesitantly. With unexpected gentleness, his fingers secured the dragonfly to her graying hair. The brief contact felt strangely intimate, the first time he'd touched her since their arrangement began. "Thank you." Elizabeth's voice sounded unfamiliar to her own ears. "For the pin." "And for intervening." Shadow Wolf nodded once, stepping back to restore proper distance. "I was tracking deer." Heard voices. Fortunate timing. Elizabeth gathered her scattered mint leaves. "Though I suspect your arrival wasn't entirely coincidental." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Apache warriors are taught to protect what matters." The implication that she mattered hung between them like the morning mist over the creek. Neither acknowledged it directly. "The creek isn't safe alone," Shadow Wolf said finally. "I'll walk with you back." As they climbed the path toward home, Elizabeth noticed he carried her basket, allowing her hands to remain free. A practical gesture, or perhaps something more. Shadow Wolf sat before his small fire, hands working a piece of cedar wood with practiced precision. The knife moved in sure, efficient strokes, revealing the form hidden within, a dragonfly, wings outstretched. He'd noticed Elizabeth's silver pin, how her fingers touched it unconsciously throughout the day. A connection to her past, to the woman she'd been before the West had worn her down. The incident at the creek 3 days ago troubled him more than he'd admitted. Not the threat itself, drunken white men were predictable in their cruelty, but Elizabeth's vulnerability. The small house the town had gifted them sat exposed on the edge of settlement, too far for help if trouble came, too visible to those who wished harm. Shadow Wolf set aside the carving and pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. By firelight, he studied the rough sketch he'd made, a floor plan drawn during sleepless hours, larger than his cabin, smaller than townhouses, with features of both worlds. Windows positioned to catch morning light, where Elizabeth liked to sit with her journal. A proper kitchen where she could prepare the foods that brought a rare smile to her face. Walls sturdy enough to withstand both weather and unwelcome visitors. A home. Not the house of mockery the town had provided. He traced the lines with a calloused finger. His father had built 3 homes for his mother, each better than the last, each a testament to deepening devotion. "A warrior proves worth through action, not words," his father had said. The Apache way. Shadow Wolf folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. Tomorrow he would begin. Dawn found him at Jenkins' lumber mill on the town's south side. The owner, a gruff Pennsylvanian, with little love for Indians but a businessman's practicality, eyed him with suspicion. "Need lumber," Shadow Wolf said, placing 3 gold coins on the counter. "Army pay, saved carefully." Jenkins picked up a coin, bit it, then studied Shadow Wolf's impassive face. "What for?" "Building. The army contract." Jenkins scoffed. "They use their own supplies." "Not for army, for my wife." The word felt strange in his mouth. Not untrue, but not fully real either. Yet speaking it aloud gave it substance. Jenkins' eyebrows rose. That dried-up schoolteacher? Thought that arrangement was just for show. Shadow Wolf placed another coin on the counter. Lumber, best quality. Something in his steady gaze made Jenkins reconsider his next words. The mill owner scratched his beard, did rapid calculations. What you need exactly? Shadow Wolf produced the folded paper, opening it to reveal precise measurements and quantities. Jenkins' expression shifted from dismissal to reluctant professional interest. This is thorough. He studied the plan. You know construction? I've built before. Jenkins nodded slowly. 4 wagon loads by my count. Delivery? I'll transport it. Shadow Wolf had already arranged to borrow the army quartermaster's wagon, another unexpected benefit of the arrangement that improved his standing with white authorities. First, load ready tomorrow. Jenkins scooped up the coins. Rest when you return with my wagon, undamaged. Shadow Wolf nodded once and turned to leave. Hey, Indian, Jenkins called after him. When Shadow Wolf paused, the mill owner asked, Why bother? Everyone knows this marriage of yours is just a joke the mayor cooked. Up, Shadow Wolf considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, despite its rude delivery. Woman deserves a proper home. Simple truth, plainly stated. Jenkins studied him with new assessment. Well, I'll be damned. Shadow Wolf's next stop was the blacksmith shop where he traded a fine deerskin for iron nails and hinges. Old Samuel, less prejudiced than most, offered unexpected advice on weatherproofing techniques for desert conditions. The general store proved more challenging. Headley's expression soured when Shadow Wolf requested window glass, clearly uncomfortable with the Apache's increased presence in town. But commerce prevailed over prejudice. Hadley took the money, promised delivery. By midday, Shadow Wolf had secured most materials needed to begin. One task remained, the most difficult. Elizabeth sat on the small porch of their current house, mending a shirt with neat, precise stitches. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work. Shadow, you've been busy in town. Her keen eyes noted the sawdust on his clothes. Is everything all right? He nodded, uncertain how to proceed. Apache ways didn't include asking permission, but Elizabeth wasn't Apache. She valued choice, consultation. I wish to build. He gestured to the open land beyond their current dwelling. There, a proper house. Elizabeth's hand stilled. Build? But we have this house. This is not a home. His voice remained neutral, but conviction underlined each word. Not worthy of a respected woman. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps even the beginning of tears, quickly blinked away. That's very kind, but unnecessary. And expensive. Shadow Wolf shook his head once. Already arranged. Lumber comes tomorrow. Elizabeth set aside her mending, studying his face. You've planned this carefully. He withdrew the folded paper, offering it without words. Elizabeth opened it, her fingers tracing the carefully drawn lines. You designed this? For us? The question hung between them. Not just about lumber and nails, but about permanence. About transformation from paper arrangement to something real. For you, he clarified. Safe place. Proper home. Elizabeth looked from the plans to the empty land to Shadow Wolf's face. What she saw there made her draw a slow breath. Show me, she said finally. Show me where it will stand. Together they walked to the open ground. Shadow Wolf oriented himself to the sun, the prevailing winds, the view of distant mountains. With measured steps, he marked the outline of what would become foundation stones. Elizabeth stood in what would be the center of their new home, watching as Shadow Wolf painted a future she hadn't dared imagine. First light had barely touched the horizon when Shadow Wolf began. Elizabeth watched from the porch of their temporary home, as he marked the foundation with stakes and string. His movements were methodical, precise, measuring twice before securing each stake. By the time she brought him coffee in a tin cup, he had already dug the first of many holes for the foundation posts. The borrowed army wagon sat loaded with lumber nearby. You're starting early, she said, handing him the cup. Best work is done with the rising sun. He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Apache way. Elizabeth studied the marked outline, larger than she'd expected from his drawings. It seems ambitious for one man. Shadow Wolf sipped his coffee, eyes on the emerging shape of their future home. One man, one woman. She looked at him sharply. You expect me to help build? If you wish to live there. His expression remained serious, but Elizabeth caught the slight crinkle near his eyes that she'd come to recognize as hidden amusement. I have no experience with construction. I will teach. He set down the empty cup and lifted a heavy post. As you taught me about your medicines. The simple equivalence of their knowledge struck Elizabeth as profound. In town, her education counted for little as a woman. Here, on this patch of earth with this unusual man, it held value. Very well. She rolled up her sleeves. Where do we begin? By mid-morning, Elizabeth's hands were blistered and her back ached, but 4 sturdy posts stood firmly in the ground. Shadow Wolf showed her how to mix mud and straw for chinking, how to test wood for straightness, how to hold nails to avoid striking fingers. His instruction was patient, matter-of-fact, without condescension. Like this, she asked, tamping earth around a post base. He knelt beside her, demonstrating a more efficient technique. More weight from shoulder, less from arm. Their hands touched briefly in the dirt, a contact neither acknowledged but both felt. Elizabeth noticed his palm, calloused yet gentle in its guidance. Different from Thomas's scholarly hands. Different, but not lesser. They worked through midday, stopping only when Shadow Wolf insisted Elizabeth rest. Desert sun steals strength, he reminded her. They sat in the shade of the wagon, sharing jerked venison and cornbread. In Vermont, we'd have a house raising, Elizabeth said, wiping sweat from her brow. Neighbors would gather, build the frame in a day. Shadow Wolf considered this. Different here. Yes, Elizabeth sighed. No neighbors who would help. He studied the 4 posts rising from the earth. Better this way. House holds the hands that built it. The sentiment surprised her with its poetry. Is that an Apache saying? My father's words. Something softened in his usually guarded expression. He built 3 homes for my mother. Elizabeth wanted to ask more about his parents, this glimpse into his past rare and precious. Before she could frame a question, voices approached from the direction of town. 3 children stood at the edge of their property. The blacksmith's daughter and 2 boys Elizabeth didn't recognize. They watched the construction with undisguised curiosity. What are you building, mister? The taller boy called. Shadow Wolf glanced at Elizabeth, his natural reticence with strangers evident. She stepped forward. A home, she answered simply. The children edged closer. Can we see? Asked the blacksmith's daughter, braver than her companions. Elizabeth looked to Shadow Wolf, who gave a slight nod. You may look, but be careful of the tools, she cautioned. The children approached, wide-eyed at the emerging structure. The smaller boy picked up a fallen wood shaving, turning it over in his hands. My pa says Indians live in teepees, he said, studying Shadow Wolf with frank curiosity. Some tribes, Shadow Wolf answered, his voice gentler than Elizabeth had heard it with anyone besides herself. Apache build wickiups, like this, but with branches. He picked up a stick and quickly sketched an Apache dwelling in the dirt. The children gathered around, fascination overcoming their initial wariness. Why aren't you building that instead? The girl asked. Shadow Wolf glanced at Elizabeth. This is for her. She needs windows for her plants. Floor for winter, roof for rain. The simple explanation carried undertones that made Elizabeth's chest tighten unexpectedly. He was building not just what he knew, but what she needed. Can we help? The taller boy asked suddenly. Before Elizabeth could respond, Shadow Wolf handed each child a small task, gathering smaller stones for the foundation, bringing water from the barrel, sorting nails by size. Their small hands worked eagerly, proud to be included. By late afternoon, word had spread. The blacksmith himself arrived with his wife, bringing a pot of stew for the workers. He examined Shadow Wolf's foundation work with professional interest, offering advice on securing the main beam. Elizabeth watched this unexpected development with wonder. The same town that mocked their arrangement now sent its children to help. Not friendship, perhaps, but curiosity, transforming gradually to something like respect. As dusk approached, Shadow Wolf stood to examine their day's progress. The foundation was complete, the floor joists in place. Tomorrow would bring wall framing. His hand moved unconsciously to the stone hammer hanging at his waist, a gift from his father when he became a man. With it, he'd built his first shelter at 14. Now it would help build a home for a woman he'd married on paper, but was beginning to know in truth. Elizabeth joined him, surveying their work. "It's a good beginning," she said softly. Shadow Wolf nodded. Not just for the house, his eyes seemed to say, for something neither had anticipated when they signed the matchmaker's register. 2 weeks of labor transformed the bare earth into something recognizable as a home. Walls stood framed against the sky. A proper roof kept out the sudden autumn rain. Windows, real glass panes bartered for with 3 perfect deerskins, caught the afternoon light. Elizabeth stood on a ladder, securing the last window in place, while Shadow Wolf held it steady below. Her hands had hardened with work, blisters giving way to calluses. She wore Thomas's old trousers beneath her skirt, a practical adaptation that had scandalized Mrs. Hadley, but earned a nod of approval from Shadow Wolf. "Almost there," she said, driving the final nail. "Hold it just a moment longer." From below, Shadow Wolf watched her work. The transformation in Elizabeth surprised him. Not just her willingness to labor alongside him, but her quick grasp of building techniques. She approached construction as she did her medicinal plants, with careful observation and methodical execution. "Done," Elizabeth declared, climbing down. "That's the last window." Shadow Wolf stepped back to view their progress. "Good work!" The simple praise warmed Elizabeth more than it should have. They stood side by side, regarding what they'd created together. "It's really taking shape," she said. "I can almost imagine living here," Shadow Wolf nodded. 2 more weeks. Before first frost, the mention of time passing brought Elizabeth back to reality. Their arrangement had specific terms, renewable annually by mutual consent. Neither had spoken of what would happen when that time came. "Shadow," she began, uncertain how to frame her question. A wagon approaching from town interrupted her thoughts. The blacksmith's wife brought her weekly pot of stew, a gesture that had become routine. Behind her came the Whitaker girl with a bundle of cloth, scraps from the dress shop that Elizabeth could use for curtains. Shadow Wolf nodded to both women, then returned to work on the doorframe while Elizabeth accepted their offerings. The interaction struck her. How he'd grown more comfortable with these particular townspeople, how they'd come to accept his presence. Not friendship exactly, but a tentative respect. By dusk, they'd completed the doorframe and hung the heavy wooden door Shadow Wolf had carved with geometric patterns. Apache designs intertwined with the roses Elizabeth had once described from her Vermont garden. The finished door stood slightly ajar, welcoming them into the partially completed house. "Should see inside," Shadow Wolf said. "How evening light enters." Elizabeth followed him through the doorway. Inside, the space felt larger than expected. Walls awaited chinkling, floors needed boards, but the roof overhead and the walls around them created an undeniable sense of shelter, of home. The setting sun cast long golden rays through the western windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Shadow Wolf moved to where the kitchen would be. Checking the chimney stones he'd laid with care. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly. He turned, caught in a shaft of sunlight that burnished his copper skin to gold. For a moment, he looked less the stoic scout and more the warrior of his ancestors, proud, strong, connected to the earth beneath their feet. "Fire pit needs finishing," he said, practical as always. But his eyes lingered on her face, touched by the same golden light. Elizabeth moved closer, running her hand along the smooth wood of a center post. "You've thought of everything. The windows are perfectly placed for morning light. The door faces east, as you said your people prefer, and south windows for your plants," he added. "As you requested." The realization that he'd incorporated her needs so thoroughly into his design touched her deeply. This wasn't just Shadow Wolf building a house. This was both of them creating a shared space. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about furnishings. I don't have much, but my father's desk. I stored it at Mrs. Whitaker's when I moved to the room above the general store. Perhaps it could fit there. She pointed to the corner that would become their living area. Shadow Wolf considered the space, then nodded. Good place. Morning light for writing. And your things? From your cabin? A look of surprise crossed his face. You wish my things here? Of course. This is to be your home too, isn't it? The question hung between them. More than furnishings lay in the balance. Shadow Wolf moved to the east-facing window. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. My father's bow, he said finally. Few books from mission school. Blanket my mother wove. Elizabeth joined him at the window, keeping a proper distance, yet close enough to feel his presence. All welcome here. They stood in companionable silence, watching night claim the landscape. The house around them, incomplete yet full of promise, seemed to hold its breath. From her apron pocket, Elizabeth withdrew a small ceramic jar. Yellow glaze with a simple pattern etched around its rim. It found this at the general store today, she said, offering it to Shadow Wolf. For your tobacco. He took the jar carefully, turning it in his hands. Such gifts were uncommon between them. Practical exchanges, yes, but not personal offerings. Thank you. His fingers traced the pattern on the rim. It is good. The simple words carried more weight than flowery praise might have from another man. Elizabeth smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way Shadow Wolf had rarely seen. Tomorrow we'll finish the chimney, she said, moving toward the door, and perhaps begin the interior walls. Shadow Wolf nodded, still holding the tobacco jar. As they left their unfinished home, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the space transformed by their shared labor. Elizabeth, he said suddenly. She turned, surprised by his use of her name, still rare enough to catch her attention. You asked before, about when arrangement ends. His expression remained difficult to read in the fading light. What do you wish to happen? Elizabeth hadn't expected such directness, though perhaps she should have. Apache ways valued plain speaking. I wish, she hesitated, finding courage. I wish to know you better, beyond the arrangement. Shadow Wolf nodded once, the gesture containing more meaning than words could convey. Then we will continue building. Not just the house, Elizabeth understood. Something far more complex and fragile. Mayor Holloway scowled at the report on his desk, then raised his gaze to Sheriff Porter. 3 weeks now and they're still at it. Building that damned house like they mean to stay forever. Becoming quite the spectacle, Porter agreed, tipping back in his chair. Half the town's been out to gawk, some even helping. Helping? The mayor's eyebrows shot up. Who would assist that farce of a marriage? Blacksmith for one. His wife brings food. Old Samuel donated hinges for the windows. Porter shrugged. The Whitaker woman gave curtain material. Holloway's fist struck the desk. This was meant to be a joke, not a community project. Seems the joke's wearing thin. Porter lowered his voice. Word is, you might owe Davis that $50. The mayor's scowl deepened. He reached for the town's permit ledger, bound in worn brown leather with the town's seal embossed on its cover. Perhaps it's time to enforce some regulations. The next morning, Elizabeth stood in the nearly completed kitchen, arranging her few utensils on shelves Shadow Wolf had built to her exact specifications. The house lacked final touches, but had become unmistakably a home. Walls chinked with mud and straw kept out the increasingly cold desert nights. A proper stone fireplace drew smoke efficiently. Even the dirt floor had been tamped to surprising smoothness, awaiting proper boards when Shadow Wolf could trade for more lumber. A knock at the door, still unusual enough to startle her, interrupted her work. Elizabeth opened it to find Cordelia Simmons on her doorstep, a woven basket in her arms. Good morning, Elizabeth. The matchmaker's cheerfulness seemed forced. I've brought you something. Elizabeth's surprise must have shown on her face. Cordelia had been conspicuously absent since the arrangement ceremony, her role apparently finished once the papers were signed. Please, come in. Elizabeth stepped aside. Cordelia entered, her gaze sweeping the interior with poorly disguised curiosity. My goodness. It's actually, Oh, quite nice. Thank you. Elizabeth accepted the basket, discovering it contained fresh biscuits and a jar of preserves. This is very kind, neighborly. Cordelia settled herself on one of the two chairs without invitation. The mayor sent me. Elizabeth's guard immediately rose.
Did he?
He's concerned about permits. Cordelia's fingers twisted in her lap. Building permits, occupancy permits. Apparently there are regulations. I see. Elizabeth set down the basket. Strange that he didn't mention these when he so generously offered us the original house. Cordelia had the grace to look uncomfortable. Yes, well, things change. The council is meeting tomorrow to discuss the matter. Before Elizabeth could respond, Shadow Wolf's tall figure filled the doorway. He nodded once to Cordelia, then looked to Elizabeth, reading the tension in her posture. Mrs. Simmons brings news, Elizabeth explained. Apparently our home requires permits we don't possess. Something flickered across Shadow Wolf's face, not surprise, but confirmation of expected trouble. He moved to stand beside Elizabeth, his presence solid and reassuring. Mayor says so, he asked Cordelia directly. The matchmaker nodded, clearly intimidated by the Apache's steady gaze. The council will decide tomorrow. I thought you should be prepared. Thank you for the warning, Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the calm in her voice. Will you tell the mayor we'll attend this council meeting? Cordelia rose hastily. That might not be wise. The mood in town is mixed. Nevertheless, Elizabeth walked her to the door. We'll be there. After Cordelia departed, Elizabeth turned to Shadow Wolf. Politics, she said with disgust. The mayor can't stand that his jokers turned serious. Shadow Wolf nodded, his expression thoughtful. Many in town have helped us. Mayor sees this. It frightens him, Elizabeth realized. Our success challenges his authority and his wager. Shadow Wolf's mouth quirked slightly. Davis told me. Mayor bet $50 we wouldn't last a month, Elizabeth laughed despite her worry. So this is about money as well as pride. Often the same. Shadow Wolf moved to the fireplace, checking the stones with practiced hands. We'll go tomorrow. Hear these? Permits. And if they deny them? His eyes met hers, determination evident. This is our home. Built with our hands, they will not take it. The certainty in his voice steadied her. Elizabeth nodded, then noticed a leather satchel near the door that hadn't been there earlier. What's that? Shadow Wolf retrieved it. From the blacksmith's wife. For you, Elizabeth opened the satchel to find a warm woolen shawl, clearly handmade. A small note tucked inside read simply, for council meeting. Stand tall. Tears pricked Elizabeth's eyes unexpectedly. They're taking sides. Taking truth, Shadow Wolf corrected gently. Some see what we build here. Throughout the afternoon, more unexpected deliveries arrived. Old Samuel brought a jar of his prized honey for strength. The Whitaker girl delivered a freshly ironed blouse for important occasions. Most surprising, 3 of the ranch hands who worked for Davis arrived with a load of firewood and news. Talk all over town about tomorrow's meeting, the eldest informed them. Davis says he'll speak for you if needed. Says a bet's a bet, and the mayor's a sore loser. By evening, Elizabeth sat beside the fire, the new shawl around her shoulders, marveling at the day's developments. Shadow Wolf worked quietly at the table, carving what appeared to be a small wooden box. I never expected this, she said softly. People taking our side. Shadow Wolf looked up from his work. People respect those who build something real. Is that what we've done? Elizabeth asked, the question deeper than it seemed. He held her gaze across the firelit room. Beginning to, the next morning they walked into town together, Elizabeth wearing the gifted shawl and blouse, Shadow Wolf in his cleanest shirt. They made an unusual pair, the aging schoolteacher and the Apache warrior, yet something in their bearing spoke of shared purpose. The town hall steps were crowded with spectators. Elizabeth felt their eyes, heard their whispers, but kept her focus forward. Shadow Wolf walked slightly behind her right shoulder, his presence a silent support. Inside, Mayor Holloway's expression soured as they entered. The leather-bound permit ledger lay open before him, a weapon prepared for battle. Elizabeth straightened her spine, feeling the wool shawl warm around her shoulders, not just a garment, but a statement. They were not alone in this fight. The council meeting was called to order, and the battle for their home began. The council meeting had gone better than expected. Davis, true to his word, had spoken forcefully about property rights. The blacksmith questioned why permits hadn't been mentioned for the original house. Even Hadley, surprisingly, noted that improvements to town properties should be encouraged, not penalized. Faced with unexpected opposition, Mayor Holloway had retreated strategically, granting a provisional permit while muttering about proper inspections. Elizabeth and Shadow Wolf left Town Hall with their home still theirs, at least for now. A week later, their victory seemed distant as Elizabeth stood at the window, watching dark clouds gather on the western horizon. Desert storms came rarely but violently in autumn. This one had been building all day, turning the sky an ominous greenish black. "Bad one coming," Shadow Wolf said, entering with an armload of firewood. "Need to secure everything." Elizabeth nodded, anxiety tightening her chest. The house was nearly complete, lacking only final touches. The thought of losing it now to nature's fury seemed unbearably cruel. They worked quickly as thunder rumbled closer. Shadow Wolf checked the roof, securing loose boards. Elizabeth brought in anything that could blow away: tools, fabric, the plants she'd started in tin cans. Wind rose as dusk fell, rattling the windows in their frames. Shadow Wolf lit the lantern, its warm glow creating a haven against the gathering darkness outside. He hung his weather-worn cavalry coat by the door and checked the fireplace one last time. "Fire's good," he said. "Should hold through night." Elizabeth placed her grandmother's clock on the mantel, a treasured possession she'd only recently brought from her room above the general store. Its steady ticking provided comfort against the howling wind. "Will it be very bad?" she asked, trying to keep worry from her voice. Shadow Wolf considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Bad, yes, but we built well." The first fat raindrops struck the roof as night fully descended. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a roaring deluge. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, seeking entry through every small gap. Elizabeth jumped at a particularly loud thunderclap. Shadow Wolf moved to the window, watching the storm's fury with respect rather than fear. "Apache believes storms carry spirits," he said quietly. "Cleansing the earth." My grandmother said something similar. Elizabeth joined him at the window. She called them heaven's broom, sweeping away the old to make room for new growth. A sudden crack split the air, louder than thunder, more immediate. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. "The cottonwood tree!" Shadow Wolf was already moving, grabbing his coat. "Stay here." "What? No." Elizabeth caught his arm. "You can't go out in this. Tree will fall on roof." His expression was grimly determined. "Need to check damage." Before she could protest further, a tremendous crash shook the house. The lantern wavered, casting wild shadows across the walls. A sound of splintering wood, then the pattering of debris on the roof. Shadow Wolf opened the door against the wind's resistance. Rain drove horizontally into the room. "Coming with me?" he asked, knowing her answer before she nodded. Together they fought their way outside. The massive cottonwood had indeed fallen, its upper branches striking the northeastern corner of the roof. In the intermittent lightning flashes, Elizabeth could see a gaping hole where carefully placed boards had been. Rain poured through the opening, soaking the interior. Shadow Wolf assessed the damage quickly, then grabbed her arm, pulling her back inside. Water pooled on their earthen floor. The bed Shadow Wolf had built, not yet slept in, stood partially soaked. Rain continued to pour through the roof breach. "Need to cover it," he shouted above the storm's roar. From inside, they worked frantically, dragging the table beneath the hole, allowing Shadow Wolf to reach the damaged section. Elizabeth handed him boards, nails, whatever he needed, their usual careful distance forgotten in crisis. Hours passed in exhausting labor. The temporary patch held against the worst of the rain, though water still seeped through in places. By midnight, they'd done all they could. Elizabeth stood in the center of their damaged home, soaked to the skin, surveying their emergency repairs. Shadow Wolf added wood to the fire, which miraculously had kept burning. "Should change," he said, noticing her shivering. "Dry clothes." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly aware of her drenched state. Her few dresses hung in a corner behind a curtain that served as a dressing area. She hesitated, glancing at Shadow Wolf, understanding immediately he turned his back. "We'll check perimeter again." "No." The word escaped before she could reconsider. "It's too dangerous out there, just—" "Turn away." He nodded once, facing the fire as Elizabeth quickly changed behind the curtain. The dry dress brought little comfort. Everything in the house felt damp, and the wind still howled outside. When she emerged, Shadow Wolf had removed his wet shirt, replacing it with a dry one from his pack. The glimpse of his copper skin, marked with old scars, sent unexpected heat to Elizabeth's cheeks. "What now?" she asked, desperate for distraction. Shadow Wolf gestured to the floor near the fire. "Rest. Storm will pass by morning." They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire between them. Elizabeth wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to stop shivering. Shadow Wolf fed small branches into the flames, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. "I'm sorry about the roof," she said finally. "After all your careful work, can be fixed." His voice held no disappointment, only acceptance. Nature tests what man builds. The wind moaned around their damaged home. Elizabeth pulled the blanket tighter, watching Shadow Wolf's profile against the firelight. "Why did you agree to the arrangement?" she asked suddenly. The question had lingered unspoken for months. He looked up, surprised by her directness. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. "Army requires civilization for scouts," he said finally. "Marriage, house, white man's ways." A pause. "But could have found easier solution. Why didn't you?" Shadow Wolf's gaze returned to the fire. "Saw you. At General Store. Many times." His voice softened. "You stood straight. Never complained. Respected by few, deserving respect from many." The simple assessment, his recognition of her dignity when others saw only an aging widow, touched Elizabeth deeply. "I was afraid," she admitted, "when Cordelia proposed the arrangement. Not of you exactly, but of mockery." Shadow Wolf nodded. "Same fear. And now?" Elizabeth asked, the storm making her bolder than daylight would permit. His eyes met hers across the fire. "Not afraid anymore." The grandmother's clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the passage of this extraordinary night. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, despite the leaking roof and damp floor, something new and fragile was taking shelter from the elements. Together, they waited for morning. The damaged house holding them safe against the storm. Morning revealed the storm's full impact. The cottonwood lay sprawled across their yard, its massive roots torn from the earth. The northeastern corner of the roof sagged visibly, despite Shadow Wolf's emergency repairs. Debris littered the landscape, branches, roof boards, a shutter torn loose. Elizabeth surveyed the damage with a heavy heart. So much work undone. Shadow Wolf stood beside her, his expression calm despite the destruction. Not undone, changed. His perspective startled her. "You're not upset?" "Nature gives, takes." He gestured toward the fallen tree. "Now we have wood for winter." Elizabeth marveled at his acceptance. Where she saw setback, he found opportunity. They set to work clearing debris, salvaging what could be used, discarding the rest. By midday, they'd made surprising progress. Shadow Wolf had already begun cutting the cottonwood into manageable sections. Elizabeth sorted through scattered belongings, hanging dampened fabrics to dry in the post-storm breeze. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their labor. Mayor Holloway led a small procession that included Sheriff Porter and 2 council members. Their expressions suggested this was no welfare check. Shadow Wolf straightened from his work, axe still in hand. Elizabeth moved to stand beside him, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after the night's ordeal. "Well, well," Mayor Holloway called, reining his horse. "Quite a mess you have here." "The storm was difficult," Elizabeth responded evenly. "But we're managing repairs." The mayor dismounted, his polished boots incongruous in the mud. "I'm not here about the storm, Mrs. Gardner. I'm here on official business." He gestured to Porter, who produced an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "What business?" Shadow Wolf asked, his voice neutral but stance alert. "Safety inspection." Holloway smiled without warmth. "Your provisional permit requires the structure meet town safety standards." He gestured broadly at the damaged roof. "Clearly it does not." Elizabeth felt cold anger rising. "A tree fell during a storm that affected the entire region. Hardly a failure of construction, nevertheless." The mayor stepped forward, document extended. "The council has determined this dwelling unsafe for habitation. You're ordered to vacate immediately." Shadow Wolf hadn't moved, his dark eyes studying each man in turn. "Convenient timing. I beg your pardon." Holloway's false civility slipped. "Storm damages house. You appear with papers." Shadow Wolf's voice remained calm, but Elizabeth sensed the tension in his body. "Very convenient," the mayor flushed. "Are you accusing me of something, Indian?" "Stating facts." Shadow Wolf rested the axe handle against his shoulder. "Nothing more." Sheriff Porter stepped forward, hand drifting toward his holstered pistol. "You'd best watch your tone, Scout." "Of course." Cordelia nodded quickly. "Just know it's available. When or if you're ready." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the work neared completion. The roof stood sound again, the damaged wall repaired, debris cleared away. Elizabeth watched as Mrs. Whitaker and several other women carried something large toward the house. "Wrapped in burlap, a housewarming gift," Mrs. Whitaker announced, setting it carefully inside the door. "From all of us ladies." They unwrapped it to reveal a handmade quilt, not fine silk or expensive cotton, but sturdy calico pieces stitched together with evident care. Each square had been contributed by a different woman, creating a patchwork of the community. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, touching the careful stitching. "Every new home needs a proper quilt," Mrs. Whitaker said matter-of-factly. "Keeps the cold away and brings a bit of color." Elizabeth recognized scraps from dresses she'd mended at the dress shop, pieces of fabric from the general store, even a square of faded blue that had once been part of a dress she'd admired on Mrs. Hadley. "I don't know what to say." "No need for words," Mrs. Whitaker patted her shoulder. "Just a bit of neighborliness, long overdue." As the sun began to set, the work party gradually dispersed. People departed with handshakes, promises to return if needed, invitations to visit town. Elizabeth and Shadow Wolf stood side by side at their repaired door, watching the procession return toward Copper Springs. "Strange day," Shadow Wolf observed quietly. "Very strange indeed." Elizabeth looked up at him. "Did you ever expect this?" He considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "People surprise. Sometimes good, sometimes bad." "Today was good," Elizabeth said softly. Shadow Wolf nodded, looking over the house that more hands than theirs had now built. Many hands make strong walls. When the last helper had disappeared down the road, they entered their home, damaged, repaired, and somehow transformed. The women's quilt lay folded on their bed, its colors bright against the simple furnishings. Shadow Wolf touched it carefully, recognizing its significance beyond mere fabric. "Cordelia brought a marriage license," Elizabeth said suddenly. "A real one, to replace the arrangement certificate." Shadow Wolf turned to her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "What did you tell her?" "That I would discuss it with you." Elizabeth moved to light the lantern, needing to see his face clearly. "It would make this official, in the eyes of the law and community." "And in your eyes?" Shadow Wolf asked, the question direct as always. Elizabeth considered how to answer, searching for words to express the transformation that had occurred between mockery and meaning, between arrangement and attachment. "In my eyes," she said finally, meeting his gaze steadily, "we've built something true from something false. Whether we sign a paper seems almost beside the point." Shadow Wolf nodded slowly. "Apache do not need papers to make promises." "What do they need?" Elizabeth asked. "Actions. Time. Choosing each day to remain." His voice softened. "As we have done." The quilt on their bed, stitched by many hands, seemed to embody the day's revelation, that what had begun in isolation had somehow, unexpectedly, found its place within a larger pattern. The house stood complete at last. 2 months of labor, interrupted by storms, opposition, and unexpected alliance, had transformed raw materials into a true home. Elizabeth walked through each room, touching walls, adjusting curtains, appreciating details that spoke of both her preferences and Shadow Wolf's craftsmanship. The main room combined kitchen and living space, dominated by the stone fireplace Shadow Wolf had built with such care. Her father's desk occupied the corner where morning light streamed through east-facing windows. Bookshelves held her modest collection alongside Shadow Wolf's few volumes from the mission school. The bedroom remained simply furnished with the bed he'd built, a small chest for clothing and a washstand. The community quilt added warmth and color to the otherwise spare space. Privacy, luxury, and safety, things Elizabeth had forgotten to expect from life. She paused at the kitchen window, watching Shadow Wolf in the yard. He worked on something he'd kept carefully hidden for days, waving her away when she approached. Now she could see it clearly, a door. Not the functional one already hanging at their entrance, but something more elaborate. Carved into the wood were intertwining patterns, some she recognized as Apache symbols, others resembling the roses she'd described from her Vermont garden. The design combined their separate worlds into a harmonious whole. Elizabeth stepped outside as Shadow Wolf made a final adjustment to the hinges. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He straightened, studying her reaction. "Final piece. Home is not complete without proper door, and this is certainly proper." She traced the carvings with gentle fingers. "Your work," he nodded. "Apache men carve stories into important objects. This tells ours." Elizabeth felt unexpected tears threaten. "Our story? Yes." Together they removed the simple door that had served temporarily, replacing it with Shadow Wolf's creation. The new door fit perfectly, swinging open with balanced precision, closing with satisfying solidity. Shadow Wolf produced an iron key from his pocket, the last he'd traded for with the blacksmith. "For you." Elizabeth accepted it, the metal warm from his hand. "Should we test it?" They stepped outside, closing the carved door. Elizabeth inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock's smooth mechanism engage. A small thing, securing their private space, yet somehow momentous. "It's really finished," she said, wonder in her voice. "We've actually done it." "Yes." Shadow Wolf surveyed their home, satisfaction evident in his usually stoic expression. "Built to last." Inside, Elizabeth brewed coffee while Shadow Wolf stoked the fire against the evening chill. They moved around each other with practiced ease. The awkwardness of early days long vanished. When the coffee was ready, they sat at the table Shadow Wolf had crafted from cottonwood, salvaged after the storm. "I received a letter today," Elizabeth said, cradling her cup. "From the school board in Mesa City." Shadow Wolf looked up, attentive. "Good news? They've offered me a teaching position. The school is expanding with the new railroad." She hesitated. "It would mean a regular salary, security. You would be good teacher." His voice held genuine approval. "Children would learn much?" "Yes, but..." Elizabeth set down her cup. "Mesa City is 3 days' journey from here." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You would leave." The simplicity of his statement carried no accusation, yet Elizabeth felt the weight of it. "I haven't replied yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first." Shadow Wolf was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the fire. "Teaching is your gift. Should be used. There's more." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "They mentioned housing for instructors. Proper accommodations." Another silence, longer this time. "You would have good life there. Respected position. Shadow..." Elizabeth began, then stopped, frustrated by the limitations of words. How to explain the conflict within her? The teaching position represented everything she'd once wanted. Independence, purpose, respectability. Yet accepting meant leaving this home they'd built, this unexpected partnership that had grown meaningful. "Our arrangement," Shadow Wolf said carefully, "was for mutual benefit. You are not bound." Elizabeth studied his face, trying to read beneath his controlled expression. "Is that what you wish? For me to go?" "What I wish." He rarely left sentences unfinished. "What I wish is for you to choose freely. without obligation, and if I chose to stay? The question emerged barely above a whisper. Shadow Wolf met her gaze directly. Then we would need to decide what this becomes. The heart of the matter, stated plainly. Their arrangement had served its original purpose. She had housing. He maintained his scouting position. The mockery had failed. They'd proven resilient beyond the town's expectations. Now they faced a new question. Continue from obligation or transform into something chosen? Elizabeth rose and moved to the mantel where Cordelia's marriage license had sat for a week, neither signed nor discarded. She picked it up, feeling the weight of the official paper. This would make legal what began as convenience, she said, returning to the table. But papers don't create truth between people. Shadow Wolf nodded. Apache believe actions show heart's intent. And what has your heart intended building this home? Carving that door, Elizabeth asked, finding courage in the sanctuary they'd created. Shadow Wolf considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. At first, duty. Proper shelter for woman deserving respect. He paused. Then something else. Something without English words. Try, Elizabeth urged gently. Please. In Apache way, when a man builds for a woman, tends her fire, protects her rest, he gestured to the home around them. These are not duty. These are choosing each day, and if I chose to stay, Elizabeth asked again, needing certainty. If I wrote to Mesa City declining their offer. Shadow Wolf stood and moved to the carved door, his hand resting on the designs that told their story. Then I would ask if you would share this home not from arrangement, but from choice. Not as convenient wife, but as... He searched for the right word. Partner. Elizabeth joined him at the door, close enough to feel his presence, yet not touching, the respectful distance they'd maintained these many weeks. I've already written to Mesa City, she admitted. Yesterday. Something flickered in Shadow Wolf's eyes, not quite pain, but its shadow. I told them I was declining their generous offer, Elizabeth continued, her voice strengthening. That I had built a home here, that I had found purpose, I wasn't willing to leave. The silence between them held all the words they'd left unspoken through months of working side by side. All the moments of growing trust, understanding, and something deeper neither had named. What happens now? Shadow Wolf asked finally. Elizabeth looked at the carved door, at the home they'd built, at the man beside her. Now we decide what we're choosing. Together. Elizabeth stood before the mirror, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her best dress, navy blue with a lace collar, preserved carefully through years of reduced circumstances. She'd added new buttons carved from antler, a gift from Shadow Wolf. 3 days had passed since their conversation about choice, about transformation from arrangement to partnership. 3 days of careful words, meaningful glances, and growing certainty. Shadow Wolf had moved back to his cabin after their home was completed, an act of respect that surprised the townspeople but made sense to Elizabeth. Despite their months of working side by side, despite the community's assumptions, they had maintained proper boundaries. The house they built together remained technically uninhabited until proper decision, Shadow Wolf had explained simply. Now that decision approached. Elizabeth secured her silver dragonfly pin to her collar, surveying her reflection. Grey hair arranged neatly, lines of experience around her eyes, a dignity hard-won through years of standing alone. Not young, not beautiful by society's narrow definition, but herself, complete and undiminished. A knock at the door pulled her from reflection. She opened it to find Cordelia Simmons on the porch, uncharacteristically hesitant. You look lovely, Cordelia said, entering when invited. Is today the day, then? Elizabeth nodded. If all goes as planned. The town is talking of little else. Cordelia smoothed her skirts nervously. So different from the first time when everyone came to mock. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. Quite different. Cordelia reached into her handbag and withdrew a small document case of tooled leather, its surface decorated with intricate patterns. I brought this for the certificate, to keep it safe. Elizabeth accepted the case, touched by the gesture. Thank you. It's beautiful. Shadow Wolf helped with the design, Cordelia admitted. I asked what might be appropriate. He suggested these patterns. Apparently they symbolize commitment in Apache tradition. Elizabeth traced the woven design with her fingertips. I didn't know you'd consulted him. He's become less intimidating. Cordelia smiled slightly. Or perhaps we've become less afraid of difference. After Cordelia departed, Elizabeth placed the unsigned marriage certificate in the leather case. Unlike the arrangement document, forced upon them by circumstance and mockery, this paper would be signed only by mutual desire, if signed at all. Shadow Wolf had made no promises. His invitation to partnership hung between them, offered but not yet accepted, not fully defined. Elizabeth had postponed her answer, needing time to be certain. Her choice came not from convenience or gratitude, but from genuine feeling. The afternoon lengthened toward evening. Elizabeth moved through final preparations. A special meal cooking slowly in the fireplace, the table set with her best linen. Wildflowers arranged in a clay vase Shadow Wolf had formed with his own hands. As sunset approached, she sat on the porch, watching the path that led to Shadow Wolf's cabin. Their homes stood separated by a quarter-mile, close enough for practicality, distant enough for propriety. Each day he came for meals, for conversation, for companionable silence as they read or worked on small projects. Each evening he returned to his cabin, leaving her to sleep alone in the house they'd built together. Today would be different. Today would bring decision. Elizabeth saw his figure approaching, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight posture, the measured stride that covered ground with efficiency. He carried something in his arms, a bundle wrapped in deerskin. When Shadow Wolf reached the porch, Elizabeth saw he'd dressed with care in his best shirt, his dark hair tied neatly with a leather cord. The respect inherent in his presentation touched her deeply. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the directness of his gaze leaving no doubt of his sincerity. "Thank you," Elizabeth smiled, emotions suddenly making words difficult. "Please come in." Inside, Shadow Wolf placed his deerskin bundle on the table with gentle precision. "Brought something for this day." Elizabeth moved beside him as he unfolded the soft leather to reveal a dress uniform jacket. Cavalry blue with sergeant stripes, polished brass buttons gleaming in the lamplight. "Your army jacket?" she asked, surprised. Shadow Wolf nodded. "From when I tracked for 5th Cavalry. Before scout position." His fingers touched the sergeant's stripes. "Only Indian to hold rank. For saving Captain's life in Apache Pass." Elizabeth had never seen this jacket, never known of this history. "You were a sergeant." "I didn't realize past life," he said quietly. "Kept separate. Then why bring it now?" Shadow Wolf met her gaze. "Because choice should be made knowing all. Good and difficult," he gestured to the jacket, "served with honor. Also betrayed my people by tracking for bluecoats." Elizabeth understood the depth of his revelation, offering not just accomplishment but complexity, not a simple narrative of hero or villain, but the nuanced reality of a man living between worlds. "Thank you for showing me," she said softly, "for trusting me with this part of your story." Shadow Wolf carefully refolded the jacket, his movements deliberate. "If we choose partnership, should be with open eyes. No secrets between." "No secrets," Elizabeth agreed. "Though I fear mine are less dramatic. Just an aging schoolteacher who came west chasing dreams that didn't materialize." Shadow Wolf's expression softened. "Dreams change. New ones grow." The simple wisdom of his words settled in Elizabeth's heart. She moved to the mantel and retrieved Cordelia's leather document case, opening it to reveal the marriage certificate inside. "I've been thinking about this," she said. "About what it means, legally, socially." Shadow Wolf nodded, waiting for her to continue. "In the eyes of the law, it would make me your wife, you my husband. But those are just words on paper." Elizabeth set down the certificate. "I'm more interested in what it means between us. What does it mean to you?" Shadow Wolf asked, his directness as always cutting to the heart of the matter. Elizabeth considered carefully before answering. "It means I choose to share my life with you, not from necessity or arrangement, but from care, respect, perhaps even love." The word hung between them, spoken in Shadow Wolf's deep voice, with neither hesitation nor demand. Elizabeth met his gaze. Yes, love, though not perhaps the kind romanticized in novels. Something quieter, steadier. Apache have word for this, Shadow Wolf said. Closest meaning in English, one who walks beside through all seasons. His hand moved to cover hers on the table. This is what I offer. In the gentle pressure of his calloused palm against hers, Elizabeth felt all the unspoken understanding built through months of working side by side. Different backgrounds, different wounds, yet a shared vision of dignity, respect, and companionship. Then that is what I choose, she answered softly. To walk beside you through all seasons. The marriage certificate lay unsigned between them, a formality secondary to the commitment just exchanged. Shadow Wolf's fingers remained twined with hers, the first deliberate touch permitted between them outside of practical necessity. What happens now? Elizabeth asked, echoing his question from days before. Shadow Wolf glanced toward the door he had carved with their intertwined story. Now we begin. Elizabeth stood before the mirror, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her best dress, navy blue with a lace collar, preserved carefully through years of reduced circumstances. She'd added new buttons carved from antler, a gift from Shadow Wolf. 3 days had passed since their conversation about choice, about transformation from arrangement to partnership. 3 days of careful words, meaningful glances, and growing certainty. Shadow Wolf had moved back to his cabin after their home was completed, an act of respect that surprised the townspeople but made sense to Elizabeth. Despite their months of working side by side, despite the community's assumptions, they had maintained proper boundaries. The house they built together remained technically uninhabited, until proper decision, Shadow Wolf had explained simply. Now that decision approached. Elizabeth secured her silver dragonfly pin to her collar, surveying her reflection. Grey hair arranged neatly, lines of experience around her eyes, a dignity hard-won through years of standing alone. Not young, not beautiful by society's narrow definition, but herself, complete and undiminished. A knock at the door pulled her from reflection. She opened it to find Cordelia Simmons on the porch, uncharacteristically hesitant. You look lovely, Cordelia said, entering when invited. Is today the day, then? Elizabeth nodded. If all goes as planned. The town is talking of little else. Cordelia smoothed her skirts nervously. So different from the first time when everyone came to mock. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. Quite different. Cordelia reached into her handbag and withdrew a small document case of tooled leather, its surface decorated with intricate patterns. I brought this. For the certificate, to keep it safe. Elizabeth accepted the case, touched by the gesture. Thank you. It's beautiful. Shadow Wolf helped with the design, Cordelia admitted. I asked what might be appropriate. He suggested these patterns. Apparently they symbolize commitment in Apache tradition. Elizabeth traced the woven design with her fingertips. I didn't know you'd consulted him. He's become less intimidating. Cordelia smiled slightly. Or perhaps we've become less afraid of difference. After Cordelia departed, Elizabeth placed the unsigned marriage certificate in the leather case. Unlike the arrangement document, forced upon them by circumstance and mockery, this paper would be signed only by mutual desire, if signed at all. Shadow Wolf had made no promises. His invitation to partnership hung between them, offered but not yet accepted, not fully defined. Elizabeth had postponed her answer, needing time to be certain her choice came not from convenience or gratitude, but from genuine feeling. The afternoon lengthened toward evening. Elizabeth moved through final preparations, a special meal cooking slowly in the fireplace, the table set with her best linen, wildflowers arranged in a clay vase Shadow Wolf had formed with his own hands. As sunset approached, she sat on the porch, watching the path that led to Shadow Wolf's cabin. Their homes stood separated by a 1/4 mile, close enough for practicality, distant enough for propriety. Each day he came for meals, for conversation, for companionable silence, as they read or worked on small projects. Each evening he returned to his cabin, leaving her to sleep alone in the house they'd built together. Today would be different. Today would bring decision. Elizabeth saw his figure approaching, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight posture, the measured stride that covered ground with efficiency. He carried something in his arms, a bundle wrapped in deerskin. When Shadow Wolf reached the porch, Elizabeth saw he'd dressed with care in his best shirt, his dark hair tied neatly with a leather cord. The respect inherent in his presentation touched her deeply. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the directness of his gaze leaving no doubt of his sincerity. "Thank you." Elizabeth smiled, emotions suddenly making words difficult. "Please, come in." Inside, Shadow Wolf placed his deerskin bundle on the table with gentle precision. "Brought something for this day." Elizabeth moved beside him as he unfolded the soft leather to reveal a dress uniform jacket, cavalry blue with sergeant stripes, polished brass buttons gleaming in the lamplight. "Your army jacket?" she asked, surprised. Shadow Wolf nodded. "From when I tracked for 5th Cavalry. Before scout position." His fingers touched the sergeant's stripes. "Only Indian to hold rank. For saving Captain's life in Apache Pass." Elizabeth had never seen this jacket, never known of this history. "You were a sergeant." "I didn't realize past life," he said quietly. "Kept separate. Then why bring it now?" Shadow Wolf met her gaze. "Because choice should be made knowing all. Good and difficult." He gestured to the jacket. "Served with honor. Also betrayed my people by tracking for bluecoats." Elizabeth understood the depth of his revelation, offering not just accomplishment but complexity. Not a simple narrative of hero or villain, but the nuanced reality of a man living between worlds. "Thank you for showing me," she said softly. "For trusting me with this part of your story." Shadow Wolf carefully refolded the jacket, his movements deliberate. "If we choose partnership, should be with open eyes. No secrets between." "No secrets," Elizabeth agreed. "Though I fear mine are less dramatic. Just an aging schoolteacher who came west chasing dreams that didn't materialize." Shadow Wolf's expression softened. "Dreams change. New ones grow." The simple wisdom of his words settled in Elizabeth's heart. She moved to the mantel and retrieved Cordelia's leather document case, opening it to reveal the marriage certificate inside. "I've been thinking about this," she said. "About what it means, legally, socially." Shadow Wolf nodded, waiting for her to continue. "In the eyes of the law, it would make me your wife, you my husband. But those are just words on paper." Elizabeth set down the certificate. "I'm more interested in what it means between us." "What does it mean to you?" Shadow Wolf asked, his directness as always cutting to the heart of the matter. Elizabeth considered carefully before answering. "It means I choose to share my life with you, not from necessity or arrangement, but from care, respect, perhaps even love." The word hung between them, spoken in Shadow Wolf's deep voice with neither hesitation nor demand. Elizabeth met his gaze. "Yes, love, though not perhaps the kind romanticized in novels. Something quieter, steadier." "Apache have word for this," Shadow Wolf said. "Closest meaning in English, one who walks beside through all seasons." His hand moved to cover hers on the table. "This is what I offer." In the gentle pressure of his calloused palm against hers, Elizabeth felt all the unspoken understanding built through months of working side by side. Different backgrounds, different wounds, yet a shared vision of dignity, respect, and companionship. "Then that is what I choose," she answered softly. "To walk beside you through all seasons." The marriage certificate lay unsigned between them, a formality secondary to the commitment just exchanged. Shadow Wolf's fingers remained twined with hers, the first deliberate touch permitted between them, outside of practical necessity. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, echoing his question from days before. Shadow Wolf glanced toward the door he had carved with their intertwined story. "Now we begin."